I'm here for my final interview for the Gloucester History Festival Spring Weekend, joined by Pepera. And so you are historian, anthropologist, broadcaster and author of your brand new book, Motherland, A Journey Through 500,000 Years of African Culture and Identity. Welcome to the British History Podcast and to your first Gloucester History Festival.
Thank you so much for having me, Philippa. Yeah, it's amazing to be on the podcast, speaking to you, and then at Gloucester, the Gloucester History Festival for the first time, talk about Motherland. So, real pleasure.
To state the blinking obvious, Africa is a huge continent.
Yeah.
500,000 years is a huge amount of time.
I know.
How did you go about telling this story?
Yeah, I don't know how I'm sitting here today. Honestly, it was a big undertaking, but no. So I did make it manageable. I think everybody would be glad to know. I decided to cover that wide range of history, and then also the continent in 10 thematic chapters. So there are 10 chapters in the book, each of which covers a different aspect of African identity and a different theme. So for example, one chapter is on oral literature, one chapter is on ancestors and the veneration of ancestors, one chapter is on female-led societies, one's on trade and migration. These are all elements that I feel and I believe are important to African people, who we are today, how we've developed, where we've come from, our societies and our cultures, and depending on the theme of the chapter, I go to a different part of Africa at a different time. For example, for the trade, migration and multiculturalism, I look at the medieval Swahili all across the East African coast and their trade with Yemen and with Persia and with India and China. And I decided to do these particular elements and came across these particular elements because I'm obviously being African myself. I'm from Ghana. That's where I was born and where I grew up. And I was just exposed, I think, and to these different elements which I saw as being important in Ghanaian culture. When I met and spoke with other Africans, I saw that it was similar in their cultures too. So community is really important. The ancestors are really important. So I felt like I had a really solid foundation on which to talk about generally African culture and African identity, and then just to dig into specific case studies just to demonstrate some of those elements.
Right. And do you manage to talk about African culture sort of transporting into the rest of the world?
Yes, I do. I think, I not only discuss what's happening in Africa, on the continent itself, what one might term indigenous African history, but I also look at African culture in the diaspora as well, where it has had that global impact. I mean, I do it. One great example, one of my favorite examples is oral literature, singing, storytelling, and music more generally. So I look not only in this chapter where I'm exploring African oral literature, I look not just at, for example, African word games and African stories and songs, but I actually talk about how a lot of that was carried over with Africans who were, who ended up in the Americas in various ways, obviously mostly trafficked, but actually just even through navigation and exploration. And so African word games have actually influenced a lot of the word games that exist in what we now know as African American culture, and actually have had a direct influence on, for example, rap and then hip hop culture as well. And you can actually see similarities between, let's say, rap and rap battles, both in their form, content, style, construction. As you can, there are similarities between that and in African word games as well, actually, on the continent. And obviously, that music and that musical style in America has had a huge influence globally. But it begins in Africa; its origins are in Africa, and a lot of the essential elements that have developed into this form, they begin in Africa and they exist in Africa.
So what were the word games sort of what was the purpose of that?
So for example, there's this word game that is played in Nigeria called Nkocha, and it's basically played amongst teenagers mainly. So we're a group of friends who are kind of hanging out, and then they will decide to play this game, and essentially it's like an insult game. So basically each you have two people, two friends, and each one takes turns launching sort of insults at one
like a roast
another.
battle.
A little bit like a roast battle, exactly. and it's before an audience. And when one person, so improvisation is really highly lauded as well. Creativity, linguistic creativity, verbal creativity, and when someone says an insult, then the audience kind of gives their reaction, and the person who launches a better insult or a more insulting insult gets even higher praise from the audience, and they make like a louder noise for them. And I mean, that is exactly what happens in a rap battle in contemporary America. It's sort of like a similar thing. You kind of have before an audience two people taking turns at these lyrical jabs, and the audience shouts for who's louder. And this is a game. This is a game in Nigeria with an origin of potentially hundreds of years, and yet its form, its construction still it exists. Amazing. in that same form.
Yeah, wonderful. What else has made it out globally?
As well as oral literature, verbal styles, music, songs. I think actually art, physical art, is another thing.
Because we're doing that with trade.
Right.
Anywhere you've seen trade links across the globe,
sure.
you tend to see sort of artistic or architectural influences and things like
exactly.
that. So did that happen?
Yes, it did. I mean, well, in terms of specific artistic styles, it's a little bit more difficult to trace, but we know that, for example, in the 14th, 15th centuries, in the Middle Ages, East Africans, the Swahili, were trading with China, and the main thing that they sent to China were ivory. It was ivory, and we have these records, these written records actually from Arab travelers, from Chinese travelers who were saying that in China the officials in the Middle Ages used ivory palanquins, those umbrella type things, and actually that was you could only use ivory for those, and if you came in with an iron one, it was sort of seen as dishonourable,
right.
And a little bit cheap, and that ivory was coming from the African interior via East Africa and being shipped there. So it actually, that material and that trade directly shaped Chinese culture and Chinese culture in the Middle Ages, because without that trade you wouldn't have this element of Chinese culture where using the ivory palanquins is seen as superior to just using the iron ones as well. And then I mean, even think that the with regards to influence and global influence, I mean, modern art is quite an interesting one. I mean, we know that Picasso, for example, was absolutely enamored by African art. There was in the early 20th century, sort of late 19th, early 20th century, and there was a German anthropologist called Leo Frobenius, who was one of the first Europeans to see what are known as the heads of Ife. So they're these brass heads made in by the Yoruba culture, which exists in what's now Nigeria in the early 14th century, and they're absolutely exquisite, made of brass, sort of single mold casted, and when he saw them, he reckoned them to be some of the greatest works of art he'd ever seen, and he sort of him and others helped introduce these to Europe, where they actually influenced modern European artistic styles too, and that's an area which I don't think has been fully explored and fully investigated. So there's sort of this medieval influence, or there's an older influence, historic influence, and there's also a more modern influence as well. But with art, with trade, with goods, material culture, those are, just different ways in which Africans have influenced other cultures, and things that I think we should explore more. And I think it upends our understanding and our conceptions of what was going on in Africa over, or definitely beyond, the last 300 years.
Yes. There's something you were talking about in your book, which fascinated me. I'm thinking we've got the bits where there's sort of, we can see things branching out, so sort of influences civilization, but there's other things that are uniquely African, that have kind of stayed uniquely African, and I'm thinking along the lines of the female-led cultures, actually. Sort of that seems to have been something that happened in a very different way to sort of, say, the European.
Yes. I think, I mean, you sort of have to go to the question of how societies develop and why they develop the way they do in different places. I think environment plays a big part. I mean, I think for example, in Africa generally, Africa is generally quite resource rich. So ownership of land and therefore the ownership of the resources on the land isn't as important. It's actually what you can extract from the land. So ordinarily, the higher the number of people you control is seen as being the most important thing rather than just the land itself, because the more people you control, the more you can get out of the land, basically. And so therefore people who, or women who were were critical to helping to expand the community and the number of people generally in a community and in a society were seen as being highly valued, highly respected, highly lauded. And I think for a lot of African cultures, that is the origins of why women would be important. And it doesn't exist in all of them. There are even actually some patriarchal societies, but actually you noticed in places, and that's why I think even in somewhere like Ghana, where it's very, very rich in gold, and sort of when you have earth, land goods, land resources that are abundant, that's when I think you tend to see this societal development of women being seen as important. And I think it also reflected what was just the belief systems and the religious aspects of a lot of African cultures. I mean, in one important female-led society, an ancient female-led society, was the Nubia in what's now Sudan, sort of southern Sudan, now South Sudan, now North Sudan, southern Egypt, and there from about 5000 BC till 350 AD, when the empire or when the culture existed, women were seen as important. They sort of start off in the early period as important priestesses who help maintain the king's relationship, or the king's relationship with the gods. So they perform certain ceremonies which enhances that relationship, and that's a foundation on which later on, beginning about 200 BC, that women, particularly the mothers of kings, newly chosen kings, or kings who come to the throne, that they become the most important people in society, and actually at one point start to rule autocratically as well. But in Nubian belief and in Nubian cosmology and religion, they'd had this close relationship with Egypt for a long time, and a lot of elements of Egyptian religion and cosmology influenced Nubia. And the story of Isis and Horus, and Isis kind of nursing Horus and teaching him how to be a good king and raising him, was one of the most significant stories. And Isis was one of the most significant gods. And in Nubia, the people saw the queen mother, the mother of the king, as Isis, and the king as Horus. So that just automatically accorded respect to the queen mother in that society. So there are different ways that it comes about. I mean, I would say that is one, and I think that's Africa being as sort of uniquely resource rich in many areas as it is, I think, is what leads to that unique societal and cultural development.
That's fascinating. It sort of puts the rest of the world in context as well, doesn't it?
Yes, it does a little bit.
So your background, I believe, is in archaeology and anthropology.
Yes,
right?
yes.
How did that contribute to you being able to write this book?
Hugely. I think with the way history's taught in the UK, it tends to emphasize written documentation, which is, I think that's changing now. Archaeology is becoming more respected and is used a lot more. Sort of anthropology, ethnography a little bit as well, although that people do say that poses its own challenges. And then oral history as well, a little bit more, but generally it's written documentation, and things like oral history don't figure as much. And the thing is with Africa is that most of the history isn't written documentation. It's in the archaeology, it's in the ethnography, it's what the people believe and practice. It's in the oral stories. It's in the material culture. So you have to look at that if you want to build up a picture of what was happening in Africa. And actually, most of the written documentation will often come from outsiders. So you have to verify that with what you find actually on the ground. I did that with what was happening, for example, in on East Africa with the Swahili in the Middle Ages, you talk about, there are Chinese accounts from the 15th century talking about these stone buildings that the Swahili made, several stories high, and some of those, the ruins of some of those buildings still exist. But from that, you can actually get an understanding of how the Swahili lived in these buildings and how they conducted trade. There's one amazing palace of a king of a city-state called Kilwa, which is on an island just off the coast of Tanzania, and he built this magnificent palace called Husuni Kubwa, and the ruins still exist. But actually, if you look at it from an aerial viewpoint, you can see how it was organized and how it was constructed. And he sort of had one end where which was primarily trade based, and you can tell because the walls or parts of the walls that exist, they weren't plastered, for example, and also you don't find and then the other section, the second section, is where he sort of lived and was more social and where he had feasts. And one of the reasons we know that is because we can find Chinese porcelain there, like Ming Dynasty porcelain, which him and his officials ate off of when they were feasting as well. And that's something that's not really written about, but something that you can infer from the material evidence as well. So that was absolutely crucial. And also, it also influenced me in talking about, less sort of about, again, I think this is something we do a lot in the history of the UK, which is, again, not, I don't think, better or worse per se, it's just different. It's talking more about figures and their lives, whereas I think when you're doing Africa, and it's partly because you have to look at generally material culture and things like that, songs, stories, mythology, you're talking more about the character, the development, the evolution, the origins of a people, rather than individuals per se. There's sometimes you can talk about individuals. I mean, I tell the story of the 14th century Mali emperor Mansa Musa because there's a lot of, he lived quite an extraordinary life. He is a lot is written about him, so we can get a lot of individual information about his life. But there are certain, even for example, this king who built this magnificent palace, Husuni Kubwa, there's very little we know about him, but and a lot of things that we do know about him come from all the material culture. But it tells us not only about him, but about the world in which he lived as well. Not just him, but how other merchants and people from other places and traders and different officials and how they all interacted, etc. So I think you get a much broader view. It's less personal, so maybe slightly more impersonal, but I think it gives you a broader view of this cultural evolution, and that's something, obviously, in doing anthropology, that's what we were taught to do, and what I became interested in was looking at the evolution and the distinct character of a people, and how that compares to people not just nearby or in the same place or on the same continent, but worldwide too.
Yeah. I find this so fascinating because, again, like, I don't want to keep coming back to UK because we're going to talk or European history, but it strikes me there, like we lack this ability to talk very easily about the culture of times. So that you can you can do that in the African context is
I think it's I mean, I think it's sort of possible as we're in the European context, but it just doesn't seem to be the general historical practice generally. It may be a little bit harder actually, because I think a lot of the you struggle to find a lot of the material just pertaining to ordinary people or the culture as a whole, because with the historical records, they tend to focus on the elite, and you tend to have this top-down history, and a lot of contemporary anthropological practice is concerned with trying to build up societies and histories from the bottom up to understand that. It's almost like this pyramid effect. You're trying to understand what happened at the base and then work your way up to what was happening with the elites as well. And I think it's also really useful the further back you go to try and understand that history in terms of culture and development, and you kind of have the material to do that rather than looking at the individuals. And in Motherland, I did this kind of blend because I'm a fan of sort of that history as well, a little bit of personal fan where we talk about these figures of the past, but I think even I noticed when I did it and when I was talking about these individuals, would mostly be of monarchs, kings and queens in different respects, and it gives you another perspective. But then also you do feel that actually there's a lot you're missing, because obviously this is quite a it's a unique part of society. history, and it's not their experience was unique and it was original. It's not something everybody went through. I mean, I did this when I was talking about a little bit to the female-led societies. I talk about this, or that chapter on that. I talk about this warrior queen in 17th century northern Angola called Njinga. And one of the things that I found fascinating to learn was that, you know, usually when we're talking about, for example, female freedom or agency in history, this can sometimes just be confined to elite women or upper-class women. And it was interesting to see that actually that agency was also afforded to ordinary women in this culture, in this kingdom, in Njinga's kingdom called Indongo, whose people are known as the Mbundu. You know, Mbundu women generally didn't have to marry if they didn't want to. They could divorce their husbands, you know, and they could just go back to their father's homesteads, and they didn't have to marry again if they, you know, if they didn't feel that it was beneficial to them. So it's something that I saw actually, okay, it applies to different layers of society rather than something that only elite women, there wasn't only a privilege of elite women as well. So I think and I think that's, you know, just it just gives an alternative perspective on society and on history, which I think is really important for filling in some of those gaps.
Absolutely fascinating. Okay, well, I'm going to have to let you go in a minute because you are on stage soon. But one last question then. What do you hope people take away either from your talk tonight or your book?
I think I would like people just to become curious about and consider the depth, the breadth and the sophistication of African history and of African societies and African cultures. There is just, I think, a tendency to see African history and then also to see African people today through the lens of slavery and colonialism, which gives us this tinge of victimization, of being downtrodden and disenfranchised. And although all of that is important history, and it should be looked at and it should be discussed and it should be talked about. I think it creates an imbalance in how Africans in history are perceived and Africans today are perceived. So I hope that by telling some of the stories from the deeper African past, I can put everything in context and I can make people curious about, okay, what was happening before? We've had a lot on this, but I want to understand a little bit of what's happening before. And then if they do their own research and gain a little bit of their own understanding, they might actually just start to see that history and African people in a slightly different light. So it's just to try and encourage and inspire, looking beyond.
Wonderful. I think you're going to do that with a
Thank
lot
you.
of people. Thank you so much for joining me, Luke.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Thank you, Philippa, for having me.